It is far easier to note the absence of something than to explain the presence of something. Quite a cryptic saying, don't you think? Well, in the remainder of this podcast, we'll try to explain what we mean by it. Obviously, we cannot start without noting that world is in the midst of unfolding crisis. Of course, what we call pandemic of coronavirus, and of course the simultaneous pandemic of panic that unfolds mostly through internet channels, through communication channels, but mostly through social networks. And that is unfortunately not quarantined as of yet, whereas it would be very good and I think beneficial to everybody if someone would shut down social networks for a month or two. And I'm not kidding in the least about it. But what we are concretely interested here is the absence of two factors that were, at least in Europe, prevailingly present now for depending on the country you live in, a decade or decades. Those two prevailing factors are, first, the European Union itself, and the second, the ideological terror that we sum up sometimes under the moniker political correctness. But to be more precise, it's thin point of the wedge, that is to say, the implementation of the right to homosexual marriage, and in countries that went further down the drain like UK, implementing the right of men to be women. Now, we won't talk about various details of these ideologies because we talked about it to Kingdom Come in the past. We'll talk about their curious absence. Let us start with a bigger thing, obvious to all, and that is European Union. At the time when I am recording this, to my knowledge and to knowledge of all people that I am in contact with, there is no European Union. Now, by this I mean that there is no European Union policymakers in the public, even saying their customarily vacuous, encouraging messages to quote-unquote European public, whereas they are mostly preaching to a court, that is to say their own colleagues, in this quite enclosed and self-sufficient bubble of bureaucracy. And there is no application of what they call European ideals, or what are in fact consequences of the recommendations and directives, that is to say orders of European Commissions, like open borders and so on and so forth. In this crisis, every country seems to be, at least to me, a sovereign one. Now, we have to note that coping with crisis is not something that countries' leadership come up on their own. It is a franchise that is applied with variances, and is being adjusted to local situations. But generally speaking, European Union, one should expect, will be preaching unity, encouraging Europeans to consolidate, and so forth, so on and so forth. They are not doing even that. They, for all intents and purposes, are suspended from existence. They are absent. Now I'm noting this absent. Now why I said that it is far easier than explain the presence, because when you explain the presence of something, presence is a temporal mode of the existence in reality of the world, confined by five senses and operations of intellect. I have to philosophize it somehow, I'm sorry. That's a professional deformation of mine. And this is a profoundly difficult, arduous, and demanding process. And to explain why something exists is very difficult and cannot be done in 15 minutes. On the other hand, to note the absence of something and even explain why it could be absent is not so difficult. Because things that become absent practically overnight are things or beings that have really not much substantial reality to begin with. I think that European Union is the project that cannot weather even the mildly serious crisis, but on condition that this crisis is hitting all the members of European Union. I'm not saying that it will dissolve after this, but I think that people will not forget that in the midst of this crisis it just ceased to exist. As the crisis came into existence, European Union went out of existence, and supposedly it is here to, quote unquote, as they like to say, manage the crisis. Well, they are managing nothing as far as anyone's guesses go. The other absence I would like to note, as I said, was the absence of NGO activity. I summed it up under political correctness. It's a tried moniker, but I think we'll understand each other as I unfold what I think about it. It will become clear, so you can apply your own terms to denote what I'm saying, to engage yourself into thinking, so not just listening to my monologue. In Croatia, last Sunday we had a semi-catastrophic earthquake in our capital, Zagreb. Luckily, there was only one death. If it happened 2 hours later, when a lot more people would be in the streets, it would be slaughter, I think. Well, luckily, this didn't come to pass. And in the midst of this, it happened, of course, in the midst of imposing these lockdown measures. Of course, nobody was locked down in Zagreb when the earthquake hit, because everybody went out. And one peculiar thing happened. First, people consolidated very quickly. Institutions of society that are not primarily political were functioning pretty well, because in these countries like Croatia and these post-communist countries, you always note when the government breaks down for some reason or another, or is suspended, everything starts to work very well. This is a very peculiar thing, let's say. And there were whole groups of people that organized themselves ad hoc. One of those were football hooligans, which is something that customarily happens in Croatia, usually in the south, but this time around it happened in the north. And they did a really admirable job in trying to help people in the midst of this catastrophe. As to note, women from the hospital they had their children in incubators, just newborn children. All those incubators were moved from this place to a safer place by football hooligans. The one group of people, that is to say, one institution that was absent completely from public, not only in the sense that they didn't help, but in the sense that they didn't say anything, like as if they ceased to exist, were NGOs pushing for all kinds of minorities, sexual minorities, pushing for, as they call it, rainbow families, that is to say, homosexual quasi families that are legally, by necessity, erode and destroy normal family, not traditional, mind you. Let us be precise, normal, as is normative by its very nature, so that we understand each other. Because I noticed that my Western counterparts, let's say people who do at least formally similar things I do, this talking or writing and publishing, publicists I would call them, use those terms like gender roles, traditional families, and such brouhaha. This is completely meaningless. This is not traditional family, this is family. This is normal family, because every deviation from it is not really normal, is not according to norm. But we talk, as I said, we talked a lot about it previously, no need to go into that now. They were completely absent. Save, I have to give honorable mention to one woman who put a plea on the Facebook that government should stop financing repair of the churches and build more hospitals or some such nonsense, sentimental nonsense, and she was quickly ostracized by people, because of course the only thing she can do is to try to exploit the crisis, because all they are doing for one, ideology, two, for the money that they get from institutions, because those, and now we come to the whys of the absence, those NGOs are in fact government institutions that are implying supranational institutions recommendations to government, so they can provide the illusion of grassroots. In these situations, you see how little grassroots they are. Now, the other thing very important is it shows how little substance in all of this revolutionary terror, mental mostly, but legal terror also, we endure, depending on the country of residence, for decade or decades. How little substance there is in it. How overnight it evaporates. Let us not, oh please, let us not forget this. Because we'll see how will all this play out on this crisis, because economical crisis that is awaiting us after this will be something that I cannot really imagine how it will look, because so much jobs are already lost, and we will be in a very, very difficult situation. All countries of Europe, whole world, in fact, and we'll see. But if in some wondrous turn of events everything gets back into normal in a week, which it will not, but let us imagine it, we must remember the lesson, I would say, of this crisis. And the lesson is how insubstantial some things are. How this terrorizing, ever-present force of ideology or quasi-metaphysics, of drive to post-humanism even, is insubstantial, and how quickly it evaporates when men are faced with reality. And evil, death, destruction, catastrophes, and such are parts of reality. If they are absent from reality, well, the bad things start to happen. This kind of shows you that there is a measure to a man. There is a measure to what man can expect and how far can man go in his projections. And this measure obviously sometimes has to be brought about by outside force, be it force of nature, be it force of his habitual historical mistakes, and or be it the wrath of God. And I'm saying this non-ironically, of course. I'm very rarely ironic. But this is not, I think, something that we should put into discussion as of now. And the thing is that civilizational dissolution, the politics of dissolution, as I like to call it, is working virtually unopposed, in a sense, not that there is no resistance, but in the sense that there is no counter force. There is no real political force countering it yet, not strong enough. If we would be to make good use of this crisis, it would be to realize how insubstantial this paper tiger is. For those who even bear some belief in those ideologies, who are infected by them, because there is no better word to express the accepting the influence of these ideas. This could push them in the right direction, in the direction of sanity, basically, and the direction of humility, because with sanity comes the recognition of one's own limits. What limits you better than earthquake hitting you in the midst of what might be called police curfew due to potentially lethal disease? So the eventual change in the direction in which countries, for instance, of Europe, I'll try to confine myself to Europe now, are going, is something that cannot be changed by grassroots actions. So let us be clear about that. It must be, I think it can be changed by two ways. One way is political. And political, if you want to change things politically, you have to have organization, parties, you have to win over institutions, and you have to use the means that are not very subtle or not very spiritual or even not very intelligent, but efficient. One of them, for instance, being inertia, because there is no greater force, I think, in political life than inertia. But using inertia consciously is not an easy thing, especially in a day and age with this fundamentally conservative act is something that really became alien to a lot of people, especially in Western Europe. The other option, if you want to keep your hands clean, because if you go into politics, you make them dirty. Don't you worry about it. This must happen. If you want to keep your hands clean, the best thing to do is the very best would be to go into monastery and pray. And I'm again completely unironic. This is the way. Maybe this is not. Maybe I do think this is the best way to counter directly anti-human revolutionary policies that are implemented by the top strata of global politics, at least in Europe. But this is not something that will that will provide you with an ability to enforce political effects by itself, because you are putting your own will in the hands of God. So this is completely different thing. But we are talking about practical politics now. Now is the time to agitate, to point it out to kingdom come how insubstantial the absentee landlords of our lives are, and to use this in reinforcing organizations that are trying to overturn these dissolutive politics. And these organizations, political parties, and so on and so forth, if they are not really too far right, are all better than this, uh, which does not mean they are good. And this is what I want to stress, and this will be in conclusion of this podcast, is that politics is not an utopia is the virus that turns politics into totalitarianism. Politics is, as they say, art of possible, but people rarely think about what is meant by this. I think what is meant by this is art of getting effects. This does not mean that ends justify the means in politics, because ends never justify the means, but that there is no blueprint that will provide you with an actions that will not cause harm, because all actions you do in politics on that grand level above individual persons is bound to have counter effects too. This is something, and that's why the compromise in politics is so important. But with ideological, metaphysical, even lunatics and revolutionaries, there is no compromise here, but by definitions, revolutionaries don't make compromises. Revolutionaries of old were people even who were putting their lives at stakes. Today, revolutionaries are in fact more like teenage political police or NGO police without a stick, and this is very important. They failed. This is so soft power centered that they never implemented force. Force cannot be implemented in, for instance, pushing the gay marriage, homosexual marriage, to take one example, because it cannot be. It has to be pushed in by brainwashing the populace and simply politicians doing the bidding of something like supranational institutions, something like European Union and so forth. But at this time, there is nothing of that. No, this is all absent. And nobody is, for instance, in my country, nobody is prosecuting anybody. Well, we all know that something like that will not happen. This is something that people who think they are important and who live out of their self-importance like to push in the public to make to create a constant state of moral panic and constant state of emergency. Now, when you have a real state of emergency, they just evaporate. Now, let us hope that they will remain evaporated. If not, let us take few lessons from this crisis. Thank you for listening. I will try in these isolation times to do a bit more work, so that you who follow Kali Tribune have something at least mildly interesting to read or listen to. We have already one article in the works, and we'll do further podcasts next week, and hopefully maybe a few discussions between Miha and me, or me and Deidre, or three of us. We'll see. Thank you for your attention.